This segment, I think, could be entitled Vellum Through the Ages. And it ought to begin with what may seem like a startling statement, that there were books long before there was printing. Most people think about books as printed objects, but we have always dealt with and been fascinated with illuminated and decorated manuscripts. The earlier, the better. And the more splendid, the better in terms of their decoration. The earliest book that we have in inventory right now is a 13th century lectionary. It was produced in Lombardy. It's got 220 leaves, and it is a monster. It's 445, well, you can see how tall it is, 445 millimeters tall, 221 leaves, and it's got lots of decorative initials. It's a liturgical book, a book that would have been used in an ecclesiastical context. Finding single leaves from a book like this in today's marketplace happens from time to time, but to find a book this grand, basically intact, there are 8 leaves missing, but 221 that are there, is a special kind of experience. The book later belonged to a 16th century humanist named Paolo Giovio, whose name is important, especially if you're interested in history and illustration. The oldest item in inventory now is a leaf from the 9th century. We think it was probably done about 850, a time not far removed from a special moment in the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne in 796 appointed Alcuin of York to be the supervisor of the scriptoria at Tours. And in the scriptoria at Tours, he supervised what was basically the evolution of the Carolingian minuscule. And the Carolingian minuscule basically was a revolutionary handwriting. And before Charlemagne, before Alcuin of York, there were a lot of regional scripts that were all crabbed and difficult to read. This was a standardized script. It was beautifully fluid and clear, and it could only facilitate learning across Europe because it was readily embraced, because why not? It could be read and it could help in the dissemination of texts. This leaf, you may notice, is not entirely there. This column is all there except maybe at the top or bottom, and that's because it came from the lining of a book. Most manuscripts, once printing began, were considered to be obsolete, not only without much use, but in a way undesirable. And so they were put to use. It's very strong substance, vellum, and they could be used as structural elements to make books sturdier. And this has come from the lining of a book. It's important, even though it's a single leaf, because the manuscripts at Tours are basically all gone, or mostly gone. 1592, the scriptoria, the monasteries were sacked by the Huguenots, and elements took care of the rest of the manuscripts, and when the elements and the Huguenots were done, then the French Revolution wiped out the rest. So even a single leaf from the 9th century is special. I have 2 more examples of vellum illuminated manuscripts. One is from about 1470. It's what's called a Book of Hours. It's a prayer book that would have been used not in an ecclesiastical context, not in a monastery, but in a private home. These books of hours tend usually to be decorated, to be illuminated, to have miniatures if they could be afforded. If you were a person of means, you would not be self-respecting unless you had a book of hours full of wonderful pictures to look at. This is a very substantial book of hours, 331 leaves, 662 pages. It's got 13 full-page illuminated borders and 33 historiated initials that have history in them. Pictures, I think, almost entirely of saints who are being venerated in prayers where the miniatures are located. The production of illuminated manuscripts did not stop with the Renaissance. They continued up through modern times. Of course, there were many fewer of them. Vellum is an expensive material. A lot of sheep died for that lectionary on the table. But for people who were interested in preserving the book arts and interested in retaining a sense of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we continued to see the production of and the purchasing of illuminated manuscripts. This is done about 1905. In fact, it is done exactly 1905 because it's signed in the back by a woman named Ibbs, I-B-B-S. Her work is not particularly prolific. She's only known to have illustrated 4 books, but boy, is it beautifully done. Done in the manner of the 12th/13th century, and the quality of the illumination is just outstanding. Now I'm going to go backward a little bit, because what I have in my hand here is a vellum leaf from 1460. And it's not a manuscript, but it's a printed leaf. And I wanted to organize this presentation into manuscripts and into printed items, as opposed to chronological. But this is a very good example of the fact that printing and illuminated manuscript production were taking place at the same time. When this 1470 Book of Hours was being commissioned and produced, printed books were also being issued. And a person forming a library would have a choice between the newfangled technology or the tried and true way of producing books. This is a vellum leaf, again, recovered from the binding of a book, which comes from a work on canon law. And it was printed by 2 guys named Fust and Schoeffer. And 1460 is a very, very early book, very, very early printed book. And not surprisingly, Fust and Schoeffer have a very direct connection with Gutenberg, the person responsible for the Gutenberg Bible, which is generally considered to be the first important book printed in the Western world. Schoeffer worked for Gutenberg, and Fust lent him money. And when Gutenberg couldn't pay it back, Fust foreclosed on his print shop, and then Fust and Schoeffer went into business for themselves, cemented by the fact that Schoeffer married Fust's daughter. Anyway, this book was printed in 1460, canon law, and it's probably printed on vellum, a good friend of mine says, because earlier books on canon law would have been in vellum, and it makes sense that this book, which is going to join them on the shelves, would be on vellum as well, even though it's a lot more expensive than printing on paper. Also, technologically, a lot more difficult. From the beginning, with early printed books, printers usually issued most copies on paper, but they kept a few, printed a few on vellum for very special clients, like the Pope. And down through the ages, printers who were interested in reaching clients who were interested in putting together libraries full of luxury items would issue books in the same way, mostly on paper, but with a few copies on vellum. This is a book by a Frenchman named Gresset, printed in France in 1867, and it could hardly be more luxurious, certainly hardly more limited, because it's one of only 2 copies printed on vellum. It's the poems of Gresset. It's a kind of a humorous story. It was very well received. Gresset, the author, was an ecclesiastic. His poems were popular enough that he wrote more. Some of them were slightly risque. He got thrown out of his order, and he spent the rest of his life in deep remorse. But it's a beautiful book, both in terms of the vellum, the illustration, and the binding. And it's no surprise that because of its binding and because of its limited, luxurious nature, it was owned by a man named Robert Howe and a man named Mortimer Schiff. Robert Howe was America's most famous book collector, founder of the Grolier Club. He owned a Gutenberg Bible on paper, one on vellum. When his library was sold, it fetched more money than any other library ever had, and the record's held for something like 50 years. Mortimer Schiff specialized in fine bindings, bought a lot of books that Robert Howe had owned. Finally, we get into what we can call modern private press books. And again, the same principle holds. The number of books issued in a private press run would typically be small, 200, 250. And then of the 200 or 250, a certain smaller number, 10, 12, 15 sometimes, would be printed on vellum. Here is Spencer's Epithalamium and Amaretti, 2 of the most famous poems in English, in a binding by an outfit named Bumpus. Bumpus is not in the first rank of binders like Riviere and Sangorski and Sutcliffe and Zaehnsdorf, but very high up in the second rank. And it's a lovely binding with lots of inlays, and it's simply a beautiful book, and that's the end of the story. Last, and in a way grandest, at least in a certain way, is the Ashen Apuleius, printed in 1924. This is one of, I think, 16 copies on vellum, in a special binding done by W.H. Smith. And because it's a large book and printed in black, red, and blue, it is simply a wonderful thing to look at and a wonderful thing to touch. It has a kind of buttery feeling, the vellum, because there's all kinds of vellum. Some that's rough and scratchy and not much fun to touch, and some that's like this. The Ashen press was one of 3 presses in the forefront of the arts and crafts movement in England. There was William Morris's Kelmscott Press, there was Cobden Sanderson's Dove's Press, and there was Hornby's Ashen Press. And for my money, the Ashen Press had the most beautiful books. And this is one of the most beautiful Ashen books, especially on vellum.